attempt. And so this is really an essay in its purest form. I'm encouraging all of you to kind of pay attention to the words, to their sounds, to their feelings, and I will speak slowly to facilitate all this. It is intentionally fragmented. I'm also going to kind of play with words, trying to make the familiar concept a little bit stranger to you. And so I invite you to create your own concept map if you'd like at the end to kind of create meaning on your own. It is unfinished, to be continued. And since this is my attempt to kind of merge together the sciences with the humanities and my own kind of essay voice, while remaining faithful to my own messy process as a graduate student, it's very possible that this experiment will fail. And so I encourage you, or hope that you will give this another chance in the future, and I will leave some details on how to do that. Okay, so I hope everyone is ready. Okay. What does it mean to have made it? When I think about the keynote, I think of speakers who have made it in their respective careers. Just 5 years ago, one of my own mentors, Dr. Mala Radhakrishnan, a brilliant professor of chemistry at Wellesley College, engaged us in a wonderful lecture about the microworld of drug design. It feels a bit surreal that 5 years later, here I am, a science teacher turned grad student and aspiring educational researcher, speaking with all of you as I'm navigating the at times uncertain pathway towards making it in the world. Whatever it is, I know with certainty that I am still in the midst of it, making my way through the messiness that is teaching, research, and life in the real world, which are words that my mentor left for me, printed into a book of chemistry poetry that Dr. Nazo just alluded to earlier. It's a collection of verses about life's many phase changes and transformations. Rather than focus on individual accomplishments, this evening I'd like to invite you to kind of actively participate in thinking, making, and feeling with me as I retrace and weave together some of the enduring moments, inspiring voices, and generative tensions that continue to shape my life and that maybe will influence yours too. So this keynote is about my life in the making. It's about my life as I've made it my own and continue to make it, but always with others, in proximity to people I care for and about, working as a collective body. I approach this keynote as an essay in its most essential form, an attempt to play with ideas or an experiment of a different kind. It's part of an ongoing experiment in getting lost and turning back to find one's way in the midst of climate change. This essay is intentionally fragmented, as I mentioned earlier, to kind of invite you to piece together the parts on your own terms, following your own timeline to make meaning. There's no single right way of connecting the dots. Research. Searching anew, searching for explanations, for understanding, for truth. As part of my thinking, I researched through my bookshelves, opening up books gifted to me by friends, family, and students alike, turning over pages and returning ideas in my mind. By returning, I am thinking with the feminist theorist Karen Barad, who uses micro-level properties of physics and sometimes biology to theorize the social. She conceptualizes returning as a practice of turning something over and over again, not unlike earthworms, turning the soil, opening it up and breathing life into it, and thus creating new configurations. This is a concept that I gravitate towards, as abstract as it may seem, and I continue to hold on to it. Beyond books, I also research through my grad student notebooks, noticing, collecting, and assembling words, phrases, feelings that move me forward and to step back, move me to make something new of words in a different context, move me to make the familiar strange. I too researched within, turning inward, asking myself, what do I want the budding scholars of the present and the future to leave with? And so with so much swirling in my mind, I turned to my notebook with pen in hand and just scribbled whatever emerged. And among the very first phrases that I wrote were thinking with, returning, and the middle. So taking the directive of always in the middle from philosophers Gilles Deleuze and Philippe Guattari, I turned to the middle, to the messy center in the thick of things, and one of the epicenters of the coronavirus pandemic, New York City. This is where I live a life in between. Here's a photo of our dining table turned into my workstation. Moving through physical and virtual spaces, traversing disciplinary boundaries from the natural sciences to the social sciences, and constantly shifting roles as student, teacher, researcher, writer, partner, friend, daughter, sister, and. This life in the middle is new for me, and perhaps for you too. For many of us, living the outside life indoors has been a challenge, one that we are still navigating, sometimes alone. This new climate is unsettling and disorienting, particularly here in the city where for this past week, citywide curfews have been in effect to keep bodies inside, to ensure order, to prevent violence. It is within this shifting landscape that my experiment is situated, a landscape that has emerged from the background and precipitated into a kind of terrain of struggle for voice, justice, and change. I'm still in the midst of attempting to process all that is happening around me and around those I love and care for. This time of COVID-19 has been full of disruptions, interruptions, and fragmentations on a whole different scale. But for me, though, this time has also been a period of forging connections, deeper connections with colleagues made possible with Zoom technology, which we're using right now, which helps to collapse the physical distance separating us, bringing us into each other's habitats. I'm simultaneously cultivating caring connections with family as we figure out different ways of living with one another and creating personal space while living in the same small space. There have also been inward connections as I reflect on my seemingly disjointed movement through the world so far. I am what some call an ABC, or an American-born Chinese, although the truth is I'm actually more of a CBA, or Chinese-born American. I self-identify as Asian American, straddling two, at times irreconcilable identities, living a kind of hybrid life. I studied biological chemistry and art history during my undergraduate years at a women's college. I belong to a family of doctors. My parents hold medical degrees. My sister, who's in the audience, is preparing for medical school, and my husband is a hematologist oncologist in training. And while I was on the pre-med track from middle school all the way through senior year of college, I eventually ventured off course, kind of against all expectations. And I did so following a kind of gut feeling that has guided much of what I do. I established my own path to become an educator, but not before exploring life as a biomedical researcher. And so today I'm pursuing my doctorate in education. And I tell my mom that I'm on the path to become a doctor, just not the kind that she had hoped for. My life over the past 30 years has consisted of twists and turns and returnings, and I'm still grappling with how to join together what seems so far apart. How do I reconcile my past training as a researcher of proteins with my current interest as a researcher of youth identity and constructions, belonging in digital spaces? How do I bridge my teachings of biology and chemistry with gender difference in curriculum? And so both of these questions point to a larger philosophical question of how do we piece together the many contradictions, tensions, and fragments in our lives into a cohesive whole, or what W.E.B. Du Bois calls a workable equilibrium. Said differently, what do we do with all that we know and learn? How do we, what do we make of our studies, our research, and our stories? To pay attention, that is our endless and proper work. These are the words of the late poet Mary Oliver, whose work I encountered in an AP language class back in high school. Her words spoke to me during my messy adolescent years, and today they carry resonances that are hard to ignore. To pay attention is not the same as to observe. My own training has taught me that observations have an objectifying effect. The observer is always in a position of power with authority, controlling the gaze and framing the narrative. I acknowledge that observations play an important role in research, but used alone, they fall short in fully representing the observed, because observations are always bounded, capturing a moment in time fixed in place. To pay attention, I believe, is to go beyond the obvious, the then and there, to consider context, history, and the larger landscape. To borrow a concept from Du Bois, it is a life work of self-work, of looking within yourself, around you, and beyond you. It means living close within our ecosystem, attuning to what is happening in our local and global communities. It means paying attention to who is missing in the work that we do. It means noticing who and what is left out in our projects. Part of doing self-work is also figuring out who we are and what gifts and resources we hold to support the ecosystem we are in. More than ever, this time of turning inward in the midst of climate changes has made me realize the important work of naming the injustices, indignities, and inequities that we witness, and the necessity of orienting ourselves towards others around us who are the most vulnerable. It is our collective responsibility to protect the most marginalized among us. I return to the middle, to the thick of it, to the messiness, the discomfort, the difficult conversations. What are the conversations we should be having in our research, particularly in the sciences? I've been thinking about this ever since my first semester back as a student. I feel it begins with all of us acknowledging the ways in which science has contributed to exclusionary practices while bringing about advancements and innovations. I feel it is recognizing how science has a history of dehumanizing and othering, of creating value systems and differentiating worth through categorizing, classifying, sorting. In my mind, I often return to my early days of teaching biology and chemistry. When some of my students confess that they can't do science, I remember sitting with them after school, reviewing the content they hadn't yet grasped. It escaped me then to interrogate the question of what it even means to do science. Science is about knowledge, yes, but more so, I've come to realize that it is about knowledges. Science is iterative, it is active, shifting, dynamic. Far from a solo activity, science is joining ongoing conversations with scholars, corroborating perspectives, challenging viewpoints, conceptualizing new ideas, collaborating across specialties, and destabilizing seemingly fixed concepts that we thought we had figured out. Science is iterative, it is cyclical, it is not a method. It is a return, it is returning, breathing new life into the old, creating novel configurations. Just a few months ago, life was so-called normal. In February, a few days before I turned 30 actually, I returned, this time physically, to Barlow to volunteer as a judge for the annual Connecticut Science Fair. And I was able to see some of my students during that time, even if just briefly. Months later, life has seemingly unraveled. This time of COVID-19 has catalyzed for me a desire to not only turn inwards, to reflect on the precarity of life, the vulnerability of our safety nets, and the need to equip all learners with critical thinking skills, but also question the seemingly benign word, normal. What is normal and how is it defined? What does it mean to return to normal life? And is that even possible or desirable? What will we be returning to? I've reached the age where I give myself permission to buy doubles of clothing items that I like. I've been living in the same leggings, of which I have 2 identical pairs, and I'm wearing them right now, which you can't see. On my shelf, I also have 2 copies of the book, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, both gifted to me 5 years apart. The first copy was given to me by another mentor of mine, Dr. Didem Vardar-Ulu, who is a professor of biochemistry at Wellesley College, with whom I researched and taught. In this book, she wrote, "Catherine, wishing you a prosperous career as you strive for balance between fostering your scientific curiosity and maintaining your integrity." These words from 2012 remain ingrained in my memory. How do we engage in research responsibly? To whom are we responsible? There have been a few moments in my own journey when I had the feeling that I made it. As a teacher here at Barlow, I remember one day when several former students visited our classroom and they couldn't find me. They couldn't distinguish me from the students in the room because I was moving among them, learning with them, learning from them, learning to learn together. I was in the middle of it all, learning to live with wonder and awe, learning to live and lead with a beginner's mind. A second moment was when I circled back to becoming a student again. This was a moment at the end of first semester, second year of my doctoral studies. I had taken my very first philosophy and education course, and as I was drafting my own thinking towards my own philosophy of education, elements slowly came together. What does it mean to be an educated person? For me, at the heart of education is enduring inquiry, a generous curiosity and eager openness to seek out what we do not know and to work through what we do not understand. This, I feel, is not separate from the goals of research and science. If we take both as a verb rather than as a noun, that is, if we think about both as practices that we engage in alongside others, thinking with and always in proximity to our communities. And so to paraphrase from the poet, essayist, and novelist Ocean Vuong, whose book talks give me so much light and inspiration and put me in tears, a life in proximity has transformative potential. So I leave us with some questions to continue pondering. How will we use our individual and collective knowledges, skills, and networks to benefit our ecosystem? How will we continue to embrace science as a verb, as an inquiring mindset, a practice, a research, as we transition through phases in our lives? And how can we actively live with a beginner's mind, with awe, curiosity, and wonder, even as we develop expertise in our respective fields? And so that more or less wraps up my experiment in thought in fragments. This is an experiment whose outcome matters less than what transpired rather in the middle. Because education and life, as I've come to understand my own, is much more about the experience, as disorienting and unsettling as it is, than where you end up. As with my own lab experiments back in college, I will likely need to revisit the process, return to what started it all, and perhaps search anew. But I guess that is research, and this was an experiment. And so I recognize this experiment also ran over. But very, very briefly, if you'd like to kind of return to this keynote and return ideas in your own mind, there's a QR code at the top or the tiny URL that gives you a transcript of one version of this experiment. And if you're interested in kind of doing some kind of concept mapping and free writing about anything in case something stuck with you, I encourage you to share what you created on this kind of online bulletin board. You can scan the second QR code at the bottom. The password is experiment. It basically takes you, and hopefully you can see this. I might have to reshare. It should take you to a page that looks like this. And in the background is just a picture of my jottings as I was planning for this. And here's a sample concept map as a starting point in case you wanted to engage with it in some way. And so, yeah, that is all.
Thank you very much, Catherine. You gave us a whole lot to think about. We really appreciate that. And I think that's exactly what some of the things we're having to deal with in all of our different lives of what this